Hello everyone, I'm back with a new video. I thought I wouldn't be able to make new Deltarune videos after the last video I made. However, I decided to make another video since this video is about a theory that is related to a topic that has been a heated debate in the fandom since the chapter 2 release. In this video, I'll be talking about the Roaring Night. This theory is going to be similar to but a bit of a variation of some post chapters 3 and 4 Kris Night videos. I recommend you to watch those videos to help you understand why a seemingly debunked theory is still plausible. Now we all at least have some idea on who the Roaring Night is. The Roaring Night is an entity that is responsible for major conflicts in the story. They possess determination to create dark fountains in public areas and turn king and queen into main bosses, as both of them worship the Roaring Night and want to unknowingly cause the roaring. Kris is the first character that we saw make a dark fountain, which made Kris Night a viable theory back in the Chapter 2 era fandom. Chapter 3 seemingly debunked Kris Night by proving that Kris and the Roaring Night were in the same room. However, I'm gonna prove that Kris Night is still a viable theory, and Kris and the Roaring Night being in the same room alone does not debunk Kris Night. There are also fictional media which feature multiple characters with different personalities, ending up being the same person in different identities. So two characters in the same room being the same person isn't a new concept. These are examples of fictional media that did so, and this concept is what I believe is gonna happen in some way in Deltarune. Before I address why Kris Night theory post chapters 3 and 4 is possible, I'd like to address the evidence for Kris Night theory during the chapter 2 era fandom that actually aged well, and the counter arguments back then that have been debunked. I've made a Kris Night theory document back in the chapter 2 era fandom where I've listed nearly every evidence I could find in support for Kris Night theory. The link to the document is in the description below. The first argument against Kris Night was that the Night shut the door behind the supply closet. The counter argument was that it would be weird for a random person to do nothing better than wait for two random teens to enter the closet during school hours when nobody is in the corridor. And my debunk was that magic is the only reason the door closes. This was proven right in chapter 4 as the door closed by itself after Kris and Susie entered the church dark world. The second argument was that King did not recognize Kris. The counter-argument was that King did not meet the Roaring Night in the first place, because he never describes the Roaring Knight's appearance and personality, and he wouldn't view them with reverence if he knew the Roaring Knight was a Lightner, since he hates Lightners. Chapter 4 finally confirms my arguments. The third argument was that Tralsei would have sensed the cyber world and informed Kris and Susie about it the instant the cyber world was made, given he senses dark fountains and hurries over there. However, this was debunked when chapter 3 showed the existence of the shelter dark fountains and Tralsei not acknowledging it in the first place. The fourth argument was that Kris was warning Undyne and the Card Kingdom kings about dark worlds because they were scared and created a dark world in their house to prove it. The counter-argument was that Kris stated the world is in danger as a metaphor for having bigger things to do in life than being obsessed with jewels, as the kings are obsessed with jewels. As for Undyne, if Kris was truly scared of dark worlds, then they'd never create the dark world in their house in the first place. They premeditated the creation of the chapter 3 dark world. They plugged in the TV, ate the pie to ensure Toriel bakes another pie so she's distracted from looking for them. They took a long time to come back, given it was afternoon when they went and nighttime when they came back, with both Toriel and Susie getting impatient towards them arriving. So late, and Kris slashing tires was the last minute thing they did before arriving to their house, as it wouldn't take such a long time for Kris to slash tires, since the distance between the bathroom window and Toriel's car was short enough that they can do it in a few minutes, even when slow walking, yet they took a long time to come back. When Kris and Susie both fell asleep, Toriel called them on the phone where she stated that she finally got through, meaning she took multiple tries to reach the police. Kris waited for both Toriel and Susie to fall asleep before making the TV dark world. It's also odd that warning Undyne is optional, and Kris specifically warned her about dark worlds and not anyone else. While chapter 3 didn't confirm what Kris did after jumping out of the bathroom window, it did confirm that Kris indeed lured Undyne into the dark world to kidnap her. The fifth argument was that Kris made the Dark Fountain to have another fun adventure with Susie. This made no sense for two reasons. First of all, Toriel was the one who invited Susie, not Kris. Moreover, it was Susie who wanted fun adventures, as she was the one who turned on the TV to watch shows with Kris for fun, and wished she could bring Ralsei and Lancer to the light world. Finally, Kris creating the TV Dark World for fun adventures doesn't work in the weird route, given they just had a traumatic experience with the player using Noel to murder everyone, and yet Kris makes a dark fountain in both routes. Chapter 3 plays with the idea that Kris was having fun in the TV Dark World, where Kris having fun is being portrayed much more ominously in the Sword Route, before Ramb deconfirms it by asking why Kris made the TV Dark World, and Kris keeps the motivations hushed to him. The sixth argument is that the Knight's goal is to cause the roaring, since they create dark fountains in multiple places, and they do in fact cause the roaring if you give up. Sure, some other Knight candidates had fan-made motivations besides the roaring back in the Chapter 2 era fandom. The common consensus was that the roaring is the Knight's primary goal. The counter-argument is that the roaring Knight would have caused the roaring since day one, if that was their goal. Yet they don't stop us from sealing the dark fountains, and instead wait for us to seal the dark fountains before making another. This was confirmed in Chapter 4, where Ralsei states that the Roaring Knight would have destroyed everything much earlier, if that was their goal, and Susie wonders why the Roaring Knight doesn't stop us from sealing Dark Fountain. This, combined with the fact that the Roaring Knight effortlessly summons the Titan before leaving and is established to work with Carol, makes the theory that the roaring is their primary goal completely debunked. Last but not the least, the argument that Kris could not walk for long distances without the soul. This argument was prevalent in the Chapter 2 era fandom, when the only way Kris could move was by walking like a zombie at a pace slower than a snail. This made most of the fandom assume Kris could not live for long periods of time without the soul. However, the counter-arguments back then were moments such as Kris walking slowly like a zombie even before they rip out the soul, and moving at a much smoother pace after ripping out the soul in Chapter 1, as well as moments where Kris performs feats such as jumping out of the bathroom window and landing back 3 feet into the bathroom. When they jump out of the bathroom window, a significant amount of time passes where Susie initially asks where Kris is, and Toriel answering Kris doing it sometimes, before Toriel eventually grows impatient that Kris did not come back, and Kris comes back when night falls, and this indicates that Kris walking without the soul is just for intimidation. Chapter 4 confirms that Kris is able to move faster and normally without the soul. There is also one misconception I would like to address. Most of the fandom thinks Kris Knight theory is all about Kris making the dark fountain in their house. However, upon closer look at the context of everything in Deltarune, I've come to realize that there is so much more evidence in favor of Kris being the Roaring Knight themselves, that Kris making a dark fountain in their house is just a tiny sliver of much bigger evidence. I'd even say that using Kris making a dark fountain scene is not even evidence in favor of Kris Knight anymore, since both Queen and Susie established that anyone can make a dark fountain, and the Roaring Knight, as we know, has a plan other than causing the roaring. Now, I'd like to address the theory. Unlike other Knight theories though, this theory requires a bit more analysis of the context that makes this theory plausible, since at first it might look like Kris Knight has been debunked. Look, the two were in the same room as separate entities, right? Well, yes, but no. What if I told you that the Kris we have been controlling is actually one of the Goner clones in the Goner Maker sequence? I know this sounds like fanfiction, but here's the thing. It has been implied multiple times in the game that Kris is some sort of Goner clone. You might be asking, but why? Isn't the vessel discarded? But then the files reveal that the vessel is in fact there. Now everyone knows that the Corner Maker sequence is all about us creating a vessel only to get ripped away by an external force. However, if you actually look at the context, you'll realize the Corner Maker sequence has been portrayed as a dream Kris had, where they had their soul being experimented by Gaster to create a vessel that got seemingly discarded. The way the dream ends is very similar to the flashback sequence in Undertale's waterfall scene where Frisk falls off a bridge. Both cases have the voice about to say the names before being cut off by a fade to white transition, which switches the scene to the two silent protagonists waking up. The Goner Maker sequence also features vessels that look nearly the same as Kris, such as identical legs, hair color, and body shape. The sweaters only have minor differences, with one of the sweaters being an inverted version of Kris's church outfit. So the fact that the 7 flying aces refer to Kris as a copy, as they talk to Kris in both second and third persons, and telling Kris to photocopy themselves to play with them. The Eggrum NPC even says that knockoffs have no right to complain, which reflects the lack of agency throughout the game, since they have parallels with Spampton, a character who went insane after the mysterious phone caller who promised him fame suddenly disappeared, and the strings attached to the new body that represented his freedom proved that freedom has a cost attached to it. This reflects what Kris is going through, as Kris has their own mysterious phone caller dominating them by reminding them of the promise they made. Kris also has the monochrome smear left on the hand after washing hands, which the narration states as something that cannot be entirely washed away, and copies are monochrome just like the vessels in the Gunner Maker sequence. There's also the scene in chapter 3 where Kris looks away when they hurt their friends. When Kris looks away, the face briefly becomes less saturated, meaning they're closer to grey, which is the color of the vessels. The 7 flying aces state that they are monochrome copies colored with care. Therefore, Kris was a vessel that was likely colored with care. The Roaring Knight goes by they, it pronouns. Kris, them pronouns. The vessel goes by the it pronoun. If Kris is the vessel, then they are the only other one who shares the same pronouns as the Roaring Knight, as they too go by it pronouns. Now, fans claim that if Kris was the Roaring Knight, then who made the sanctuaries? At first, it seems impossible for Kris to make the sanctuaries, until you realize a detail that can be easily missed. In the kitchen scene when the soul was in the vents, the phone caller was talking to Kris about creating the sanctuaries. Then the phone caller starts referring to Kris in third person, implying Kris needs the soul in the dark worlds, otherwise something bad will happen to them. Then the prophecy describes Kris as a cage with human soul and parts. Cages are inherently artificial, and Kris's body was never referred to as human. Only their soul is referred to as such. It's also very suspicious that Kris is the only one described without any deeper personality. Susie is described as the girl with hope crossed on her heart, and Ralsei as the prince alone in the deepest dark. This all leads to an interesting question. What would happen if Kris without the soul enters a dark world? If the soul is described as the culmination of one's being, and dead people are objects turned into darkness by the dark fountain, then wouldn't that make Kris closer to an object than a person, or in other words, a vessel made to host the soul by Gaster? You've probably heard of a few cracked theories that Kris is some sort of darkener, and there's a track called Meat Factory in Undertale which spawned theories like it's an area where vessels are being manufactured. My guess is that the meat factory is likely the shelter, but I'm not confident about this guess. Anyways, the cage also reflects how Kris blatantly shoves the soul into the birdcage, since the narration implies the birdcage wagon has been recoiled backwards. Kris confirms in chapter 4 that the birdcage is used for trapping the soul inside, rather than a bird. If Kris needs the soul in the dark world, then what about moments where Kris rips out their soul? Well, if original Kris is the Roaring Knight, then it's very likely the original version of Kris was channeling their will through the Goner copy, so they don't reveal themselves as the Roaring Knight and instead stay as they are but move around without their soul, while their Goner copy is making the sanctuary dark fountains. It also explains why soulless Kris can still perform the same things they did when they had their soul inside. The Roaring Knight is known for mistreating their objects. In the weird route, we enable a sadistic part of Kris that they suppress so hard, which causes them to murder not just the darkness, but also lighteners like Susie, Ralsei, and Birdley, as shown in the sword route. The Roaring Knight seems to be a mishmash of multiple lighteners. Papyrus shares the knight's skeletal frame, Carol has pointed antlers and a long sword, Des has stars, poster and being missing, Rudy has symptoms of lung disease, I guess. The Roaring Knight has a deer skeleton that is common with the entire Holiday family. Azrael only has stars, sword, and hypergoner attacks. Metatron has only one pose that is in common with the Roaring Knight. Alphys has a lock of hair sticking out like the Roaring Knight does. However, the Roaring Knight has traits unique to one Lightner out of all Lightners, and that is Kris. First of all, Kris gets knighted by the Roaring Knight. This is pretty self-explanatory, so I don't need to elaborate on it. Secondly, the Roaring Knight shares not one, but multiple poses with Kris. Kris points and hearts come out. The Roaring Knight points and stars come out. Kris and the Knight are both known to aura farm. Both Kris and the Black Deer mirror each other's movements. The Knight performs an X slash similar to Kris's X slash attack. There's a lot more as shown here. The poses aren't the only things that matter about Kris Knight. Chapter 4 established a new mechanic where the dark fountains created by the Roaring Knight have the same lighting as Kris, as Susie's dark fountain had a completely different lighting of the mind, which is a metaphor for someone's perspective on the world in general. I don't think Kris working with the Roaring Knight explains this phenomenon at all, because a person working with someone of a higher authority doesn't necessarily have the same perspective and motivations as the higher authority. They work for higher authority for their own reasons. Not to mention, it wouldn't make sense for Kris to work with someone whose mere presence gives them trauma. The church NPC calls Kris the knight who casts a shadow on the land. While the church NPC does state he has no proof of it, it can be used as foreshadowing of Kris being the Roaring Knight. Then there's the fact that the prophecy knife and the knife queen depicted in her pictogram are very similar to the knife silhouette in the mini-games Legend of Tenna and the Sword Route. Susie tells both Kris and the knight that quiet people piss her off. Kris and the Roaring Knight are both implied to carry out fate, since both create dark fountains to fulfill the prophecy, and the knight battling the heroes is the knight fulfilling the prophecy. While it's true that Susie carries out fate, her description changes to faces fate once she obtains the Justice Axe after winning against Gerson, whereas Kris' description remains the same. Then there is also the issue of Gerson himself that the fandom brings up. If Kris is the knight, then why does Gerson appear in the knight's Sanctuary Dark Worlds, but not Susie's Sanctuary Dark World? The problem with this notion is that it assumes the Roaring Knight is somehow personally tied to Gerson by using Ralsei's statement about darkness belonging to a loved one only appearing in specific darknesses. The issue with the claim that the Roaring Knight is tied to Gerson is that not only does Gerson and the Knight not recognize each other, but also Gerson was revived as a darkener from his dust, whereas Susie's Dark Fountain revived the statue of Gerson. Darkness is tied to imagination and mental state in Deltarune. Therefore, Ralsei talking about darkness being based on loved ones existing in specific darknesses is Ralsei implying that Gerson was revived from the dust rather than the statue, because the dust is dead Gerson who was admired by the entirety of hometown. Whereas the Sound of Justice is formed by the statue that is an artistic representation of said well-known figure of hometown. It's like reviving a corpse versus bringing the illustration of a corpse to life. Another important detail the game shows is that Tenna stated that he made a deal with the Roaring Knight. The fandom was afraid this moment made Kris Knight real, but when the Roaring Knight appeared, the fandom cheered that Kris Knight theory is dead. However, the Sword Route has Tenna state that Kris made the deal with him. Tenna stated the Roaring Knight made a deal with him when he was a TV in the Light World, and there was no indication in the Light World that the Roaring Knight we encountered made a deal with him at all. The deal was entirely Kris's doing. Both Kris and the Knight share similarities in terms of appearance as well. The Roaring Knight wears shoulder pads which are similar to the shoulder pads in Kris's rockstar outfit. Both are modeled after medieval knights in classic fantasy literature. During the Live Alive interview, Toby Fox compared Kris to a protagonist from the video game Live Alive, and that protagonist is a typical fairy tale knight who becomes a fallen hero at the end of the chapter. Kris is being called a sword-wielding fantasy knight who may play another role than a simple hero. Fans dismiss it as Kris versus player conflict, but Toby talks about this as if it's a plot twist that occurs near the end of the game. Therefore, it wouldn't make sense if it was about Kris versus player. At best, the Kris player dynamic is only a foreshadowing of their other role, rather than their other role itself. And we all thought Kris versus player was the only problem Kris had back in the Chapter 2 era fandom, but the newer chapters reveal that Kris versus player is a part of a much more complex conflict that we had no idea about. If fans wonder if Kris is the Roaring Knight, then why isn't Susie the Roaring Knight, given that she is called a Dark Knight in Chapter 2 and makes a Dark Fountain in Chapter 4? Why isn't Birdley the Roaring Knight, because he called himself a knight in glow-in-dark armor, and the Roaring Knight shapeshifts into a bird? Or why aren't Undine and the Royal Guards the Roaring Knight, given both wear armor and the Royal Guards carry swords? Why aren't Azriel and Carol the Roaring Knight, given both wield the same weapon as the Roaring Knight? Well, Susie doesn't wear actual armor. She's only called a knight because gameplay-wise she's in the same class as a knight, since she's a tank who protects her friends. Her trademark weapon is an axe and not a sword. Birdley calling himself a knight is him being haughty to try to impress Queen. And like Susie, his weapon isn't a sword either. He also wears a more futuristic sci-fi outfit than a medieval knight outfit. Undine's weapon isn't a sword either. Her weapon is a spear, plus she plays a completely different role from the Roaring Knight. She's someone looking for challenges and is bad at solving crime. She doesn't know about dark worlds the way Kris knows. Plus she has been literally kidnapped by the Roaring Knight to be sacrificed by Kris. The Royal Guards cannot be the Roaring Knight, not only because their Undertale counterparts don't exist in Deltarune, but the Deltarune counterparts are pretty much irrelevant to the story, as they don't have human hunting sessions of any kind. Now, one question you might be asking right now is, why does the Roaring Knight look weird if it's just another dark side of Kris? Why does the Roaring Knight shapeshift, glitch, and have a goopy appearance? Even the swords they summon look like they are a part of the Roaring Knight's body. Well, this is because the Roaring Knight is in the same category as Titans. You see, Titans are made out of goopy darkness, come in various shapes, and can glitch when hit. They are stated to be born from the fear of the dark, which is the shadow of the backside of the mind. The Roaring Knight is designed the same way to the Titans from the visual of Ralsei's roaring description. What makes the Roaring Knight different from the Titans, though, is that they are much more sentient than average Titans that are described as mindless entities that only exist to destroy. The fact that the Roaring Knight shares a special connection to Kris and lives in the shelter indicates that Kris had a backstory that caused them to develop a fear of the shelter, and the Roaring Knight to develop some sort of sentience. Kris's trauma also explains why they do not want to see the knight in Chapter 4. If you attempt to equip the Shadow Mantle on Noelle, she rejects it by stating that it's for someone taller. This is an interesting line, because while you can equip the Shadow Mantle on Susie and Ralsei, who are much taller than Kris, and Kris themselves can equip the Shadow Mantle despite being shorter than the rest of the party members, Noelle rejects it despite being much taller than Kris as well, and points that it's meant specifically for one person who is taller than her. The Shadow Mantle is obtained from Iram, the boss that represents Kris's intrusive thoughts, and equipping it causes you to be highly effective against dark and star attacks like the Roaring Knight's attacks. Iram makes fun of Kris for being unable to reach the mantle. Hero Sword, or 8-bit version of Kris, was too short to reach the mantle. Therefore, the real Kris, who is the taller version of Kris, had to step in to reach the mantle. The closet narration states that a large person can fit inside in both the computer lab and the church, and Kris refuses to open the church door. While the fandom's version of Closet Night doesn't logistically make sense in Chapter 2, it could make sense in Chapter 4. If the Roaring Knight is the large person hiding behind the church door that Kris refuses to open, it's likely that Kris doesn't want to see a version of themselves so terrifying that they decided not to open it. What happened that made the original version of themselves the Roaring Knight is tied to trauma in the shelter, which explains why they didn't want to talk to Susie about it and why they initially did not want to face Iram in the shelter. Now let's address the common night candidates as of the recent chapters. First is Rudy Holiday. The supposed evidence is that the Roaring Knight emits an energy that causes Kris to develop heart problems, and the Roaring Knight themselves behaves like a lung cancer patient. Rudy is someone who suffers from lung cancer. The Roaring Knight possesses antlers like Rudy. The hospital is relatively close to places the Roaring Knight makes dark fountains in. Rudy might be ill because he is affected by overwhelming determination. However, the problems with arguments relating to Rudy's illness are that Rudy's illness isn't supernatural. It's a naturally occurring cancer that the doctor spotted. He doesn't display supernatural animalistic behaviors that the Roaring Knight does. Plus, the Roaring Knight glitches, produces static, and shapeshifts. The Knight also moves faster than Susie could catch up to them, and it doesn't make sense to be Rudy since his illness got worse after just walking to the church by himself. Some claim the Roaring Knight is Rudy's illness. However, Rudy's illness doesn't explain what the Knight would be sentient enough to aura farm, kidnap, undyne, or even respond to the fun gang in a calculating way. His antlers also do not match the Roaring Knight either, since Rudy's antlers are straight and flat, whereas the Roaring Knight's antlers are bent and pointed. The Roaring Knight also murders Stena and Jackenstein and is willing to risk the roaring, which is not something Rudy would do. Another Knight candidate that used to be taken seriously back in the Chapter 2 days of the fandom but is a meme candidate now, with some hardcore believers still holding on to this theory, is Papyrus Knight. The problem with this theory is that Papyrus is barely relevant in Deltarune. He doesn't have a single mandatory dialogue nor narration. Most of his mentions are jokes about not showing up in Deltarune. Toby even stated during the 10th anniversary livestream that all the main Lightners are being introduced in Chapter 1. So it would be stupid if a character suddenly shows up and takes too much spotlight from the main characters. Not to mention, Papyrus Knight would require playing the previously well-known game Undertale. While Toby did recommend us to play Undertale before Deltarune, and even stated the two are connected, he only stated it in regards to familiarizing yourself with the characters and the gameplay mechanics, rather than confirming that a character who never showed up in Deltarune with no mandatory mentions is somehow the overarching villain of the entire game. Not to mention, what is Papyrus's motivation in making dark fountains? The Roaring Knight, despite not being either of the holidays, has connections to the holidays that are Carol and Noel. How is Papyrus connected to the holidays when he's new in hometown? Plus, bones are Papyrus's signature weapon, not a black knife. The Knight's body proportions are also different from Papyrus, as the Knight has a shorter spine torso than Papyrus, has arms that reach the knees unlike Papyrus, whose arms reach the thighs, and has longer arms than Papyrus. Papyrus Knighters suggest that he was being manipulated by Gaster to make Darkner friends because he's a shut-in. This would have been more believable back in the Chapter 2 days, but it no longer makes sense now, as the Roaring Knight doesn't display any traits that imply they want to make Darkner friends. They are shown to be sadistic as they are willing to put Toriel and Undyne in danger, ruthlessly murder Tenna and Jackenstein, knock two members of the Fun Gang unconscious, and summon Titans to cause destruction. Papyrus is not the type of person to commit heinous acts, even when he's lonely. Papyrus stated that there are no skeletons in the closet except him, sometimes, and skeletons in the closet is a metaphor for hiding the worst aspects of yourself. The joke here is that the line refers to Papyrus lacking any worst aspects of himself, but he's a literal skeleton monster hiding in his closet. This has nothing to do with the Roaring Knight hiding in closets. Both of the encounters have fog-like textures in them. However, Papyrus's fog is meant to parallel your encounter with Sans because the fog is meant to create a silhouette of you in them. The Knight's fog, however, blurs your vision so you are unable to see where you're going. and it's the image depths background present where the titans and dark fountains are made out of, and is the background of the Goner Maker sequence, the same background in my video. Then there's the second most popular knight candidate, and that is Carol. She's the red herring of the knight candidates because she displays some of the knight's qualities but plays a completely different role from the roaring knight. She uses a katana as her weapon, is antagonistic towards Susie, treats Kris better than anyone else, seemingly kidnapped Undine in the light world, and has pointed antlers. She is also the phone caller. However, the roaring knight uses a much more generic sword and knife rather than specifically a katana. Plus, if Carol is the roaring knight, then the game wouldn't emphasize the roaring knight's identity, such as Kris hiding its identity by diverting our attention to Jockington and refusing to open the church door. Carol also has no way to get into the church before Kris and Susie. Carol's personality also doesn't seem to match the knight, as Carol does not have the edgy teen or farming behavior that the knight has. She's cold and focuses more on efficiency than entertaining herself. Plus, the roaring knight shapeshifts, glitches, and produces static, whereas lightners are physical beings that can bleed. Even the armor and the helmet that the knight wears aren't solid but rather goopy darkness. Her role most likely has to do with bringing death back rather than battle the heroes. Now I'll move on to the most popular knight candidate, and that is December Holiday. She's popular because she sounds like the most convincing knight candidate. She cannot be conventionally debunked because she's missing, and missing characters turning out to be antagonists have been done in fictional media multiple times. The Roaring Knight also seemingly carries a bat, is associated with stars, has antlers, seemingly plays the guitar in Chapter 4 and the Mother 3 parallels. The Black Knife also seemingly has the Lost Girl motive, and the Roaring Knight in ball form looks like a baseball. Kris and the Knight's poses being similar is a result of Kris looking up to death. They sound convincing, but when you actually analyze the details, you'll realize a lot of them are either ambiguous or fall apart. Bat in the initial sprite isn't actually a bat, it's a sword. It has a pointed tip on top that bats objectively do not have. A bat with a pointed tip is unusable in sports, and sports is something Des used to like. Plus, bats bonk, not slash. The knight doesn't actually look like a baseball. We have seen baseballs in Deltarune, and they resemble closer to real-life baseballs rather than the ball form the knight has. The knight's ball form, if anything, resembles a yin-yang more than a baseball, which could symbolize its connection to light and dark. There's no Lost Girl in Black Knife, as the music contours of the Black Knife do not align with the contours of Lost Girl and Raise Up Your Bat. Not to mention, Lost Girl isn't Noel nor Des's exclusive theme, and Toby states that the song plays even when Noel is not around, as it plays during Sad Susie, Ralse, and Gerson scenes too. If Kris and the Roaring Knight's poses are a result of Kris looking up to Des, then it would make no sense for the Black Deer to follow Kris's movements rather than the other way around. It also assumes Des is the Roaring Knight, as there is no evidence that Des did any of the poses Kris and the Knight share. There is also the fact that Kris survived several years without Des's influence, which is enough for Kris to form their own identity outside Des. Another argument that weakens the idea that Kris looked up to Des is that Kris and Des had a rough relationship. Des hit Kris with a rifle bat or scolded them every time Kris pranked Noel. While Kris playing guitar in the rhythm game could look like Kris and Des were close, Tenna's whole thing in the game was about bringing up Kris's past, which made Kris uncomfortable. The Mother 3 connection doesn't make sense, not only because Toby was referring to Undertale in that interview, where he said he's unoriginal if Mother 3 came out to the West, but also Claus, the character the fandom associates with Des, is the sibling of the protagonist, and not the fourth party member. Des, like Rudy, also has straight and flat antlers, unlike the Roaring Knight. Stars aren't exclusive to Des, as Kris and Azrael are associated with stars too, and Kris reaches out to the save point as if they are reaching out to stars. The Roaring Knight has never shown to play guitar. The room before the final prophecy room doesn't have the Roaring Knight inside. Therefore, it would make no sense for the knight to randomly push Kris forward. It could just be a memory of Des telling Kris to move forward. And not to mention, the lyrics of Raise Up Your Bat and Don't Forget are thematically against what the Roaring Knight represents. This is the one encouraging Kris to move forward and guiding them through the darkness, which is the complete opposite of what the Roaring Knight represents. And Des is closely aligned with the soul, which represents the light of hope. Des, unlike other knight candidates, does not have a proper motive as the Roaring Knight. Fans use the unused code to indicate that Des was trapped in darkness and became the Roaring Knight. However, it's not confirmed whether Des is the unused code or not. While this unused code is possible, it's also likely to be Noel because first of all, the code talks in a demure fashion, even though Des, based on her room, the lyrics of Raise Up Your Bat, and the way Tenor describes Des is implied to be a tomboy. Secondly, the voice reminisces the good times she had with her family, similar to how she reminisces her past. Thirdly, she experiences nightmares about dark worlds just like Noel did in the Weird Road. Finally, she thanks you for listening to her just like how the Chapter 4 newsletter and the Think About Noel scene in Chapter 4 thanks you. You might wonder why Noel makes more sense than Des, given Noel is right there and not lost. However, we don't know the context behind the unused text, but it's definitely content that will be revealed in the upcoming chapters, probably in the form of flashbacks or future content. Even if we assume Des is the unused code, lighteners do not get corrupted by darkness, as the roaring which fills the entire world with darkness only affects darkners, whereas lighteners are in the state of ending for themselves for eternity. The unused code doesn't behave like darkness mutated her. She simply doesn't remember time, but she remembers how she got here. To conclude, just because Kris and the Roaring Knight ended up in the same room doesn't make Kris Knight any less valid. The two are much more spiritually connected than just Kris and the Knight working together. Thanks for watching this video.